It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That's Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. It is a fact or fiction edition of the show, Logan. We're going to take some thoughts, some of them very Commanders specific, some of them more global around the NFL, but certainly apply to the Commanders, and discuss whether they are fact or fiction. Seems easy enough, yeah?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, so the first one is very Commander-centric. It is Sam Howell. And there's this myth, or maybe it's there's a thought. Well, you'll be able to tell me whether it's a myth or not. It's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but you have a much better answer than me. That if the Commanders move on from Eric Bieniemy in the offseason and bring in a new offensive coordinator, Sam Howell will be learning a third system in 3 years. How much would that hurt him is kind of the big question we're trying to tackle. And you know, that would hurt Sam Howell. Like that's the fact or fiction. But I think in that there's also kind of this sub question I have for you, which is, let's say they hire a Ben Johnson or a Bobby Slowick, someone who runs a West Coast based system, which obviously Eric Bieniemy does as well. How much of a learning curve is that even in the first place to go from one West Coast system to another? But fact or fiction, to be a good host, a third system in 3 years would hurt Sam Howell.
I mean, hurt's probably like, it's all relative, right? I think it affects Sam Howell? Yes. Is it hard to learn an offense? Yes. Is it going to somewhat stunt him? I would say yes. And the reason I say that is just because there is a time period and an ownership that takes place of an offense. And so like, what I mean by that is, you know, I think he'll know the route concepts. I think he's shown that he's a smart guy, that he can learn concepts really quickly. To me, I think it's the stuff that takes you from kind of average quarterback to great quarterback that'll be stunted here, right? And so that's the stuff where it's understanding how dagger works versus cover 2 as opposed to cover 3, how I can manipulate that hook player on horn as opposed whatever, like that's the stuff that needs to kind of be acknowledged in terms of things that'll be challenging. And then I think the other element is the protection stuff is been something that he's gotten better at as the year goes on, and for whatever reason that's something that takes running backs a long time to learn, takes offensive linemen a long time to learn, takes quarterbacks a long time to learn. So I do think, yes, it will affect him. It could be negative, but I also think perhaps if you get a guy in here who's, again, like maybe a little more balanced, like some of those things that will be regressed, maybe are covered up a little bit better, right? We're going to run the ball a little bit more. We're going to lean into the play action pass more. We're going to lean into RPOs a little bit more. Not to say that EB hasn't found things this year for Sam, but I do think like running the ball, like you mentioned Ben Johnson, they run the ball a ton. I think they're top 4 in attempts this year. It's part of their identity. It's part of who they are. Those are times where, again, you're alleviating some pressure on the quarterback in a more kind of quarterback friendly way. And obviously EB's done that with quick game, with sprint outs, with some RPO stuff, but there are levels to this. And to me, just looking at it from a 1,000-foot view, I think the simplest way to kind of correct that is just, we're running the ball more. We're going to hit more play action shots. We're going to be more proactive in kind of a Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, Sean McVay way of finding easy throws down the field. So I think while there is a challenge to learning, I think there are certain systems that can make certain things easier. Like, yes, is he going to have a hard time learning a new system? 100%. But are there systems that are maybe a little bit more quarterback friendly? Potentially. And again, that's something that remains to be seen. But I do think it's more complicated than saying, oh, they're learning a new offense, it's bad for Sam. Of course it's going to be hard for Sam, but maybe there's other elements of that system that speak to Sam's skill set a little bit better.
To go back to the very first thing you said, it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
To me, the answer to this question lies in a different question. What is more detrimental, learning the new system and the gap that exists there, or staying in a system that's not maximizing your player? Like, would you rather be in a better system and have to learn it, or stay in an inferior system but have continuity if you do believe this system is inferior, which I am very on record as saying I do, the way it's being run right now, right? So is there going to be a learning curve to some extent? Yes. And I want to dive again into the West Coast to West Coast thing and talk about what could change from system to system, because you've gone through that process in your career. I, believe it or not, never changed NFL offenses. But I think that, to your point, like a guy like Johnson has worked so well with Jared Goff because he's taken a lot off of his plate. He's simplified things down. what Kyle has done with Brock Purdy and others out in San Francisco, the way that Sean worked with Goff in those first couple of years that did get them to a Super Bowl that they lost, but did get them to a Super Bowl early on. And some of the, what Kevin's done with Kirk in Minnesota, best couple of years of his career up there. So the examples, Slowick and with CJ Stroud, like the examples are endless around the NFL. What Andy and EB was on that staff as well did with Alex Smith back in the day. Like they found a way to win football games with not Patrick Mahomes. And so I would rather have a system that really resembles those different systems and have Sam have to learn it, but insulate him more than I would to stay with the current layout. Now, obviously, EB could change it. I think that's also something you have to give credit. That's something we've talked about with Eric is like, this is his first year as a play caller. So would he take this offseason to self-scout, self-study, and ultimately change how he called it next year? Potentially. But I would rather go through the change personally. With that said, let's say they do go to a different West Coast system. What are the easy parts of that transition? What are the hard parts? Like what changes, what stays the same West Coast to West Coast?
Yeah, I think people always talk about learning offenses in terms of language. And there's obviously like the Latin-based languages in English. And so like when you're in Spanish class, and you're like, oh, this word sounds a lot like the English word. And then like the French word sounds a lot like the English word. There is, in a West Coast offense, there's a lot of that, right? So you'll be in your install and you're like, oh, we're going to run stick. And they might call it something different, but day one is going to be stick. And we got drag and we got slant flat, which is drag. We got double slants. And they might have some different language for it, but at least the coaching points and like kind of the general distribution of the concept are relatively similar. So like when we went from, Kyle to Sean here, obviously there was a lot of carryover and it was really Jay's offense. And so there was some verbiage differences. The protections were a little bit different. The concepts there was a different point of emphasis on the concept potentially, but on the whole, it's very, very similar. Then I went from here to Chicago. It's a West Coast system. And even though I've been on record as saying the verbiage there was insanely hard to learn, conceptually, the stuff was similar to what we learned when I was with Kyle. It was very, very similar to that, right? Then I go to San Fran, and even going from Kyle to Kyle again, the offense changed and it molds, and the focus is a little bit different, the coaching is a little bit different, but the picture's relatively the same. And so I do think like going from West Coast to West Coast, it's hard, obviously, and obviously there's different perspectives from a coaching standpoint, but it's not as hard as going like when I went from Atlanta to Houston, which is again that kind of New England, whatever that offense is up there, kind of its own tree. It was very challenging for me to learn that because I had no point of reference. I was like, okay, this looks like drive, but they're not, the read's different, the coaching point's different, the tight end sits in a different spot. So it's like you're going from a Latin-based language to a Germanic-based language. Like the crossover isn't quite the same. So I think that's something that I would feel very comfortable is that, is there going to be a point of transition here from him in terms of learning what the new coordinator, or even if EB changes what he's doing, like there will be learning this offseason for Sam. It's just about, I think going from West Coast to West Coast, in my personal opinion, is significantly easier because, again, there are enough similarities where you're like, okay, like I got that. Like that's, okay, I got to tighten my split on this. That's how we did it last year. Or this is the depth and this is the read. And it all kind of layers out the same. And again, there's some nuance and some variation, which you have to learn. But I think on the whole, West Coast to West Coast, in my opinion, is much easier.
I take everyone back to the vaunted year of 2018 in Washington football history. Yes, that is the Alex Smith to Colt McCoy to Mark Sanchez year. And Sanchez talked about this quite a bit when he had to take over at, obviously Kevin O'Connell had a huge say in that offense as the offensive coordinator, but it was Jay's offense. But because it was West Coast and it was similar to what Mark had run in New York, Kevin was able to literally translate when they were on that short week after Colt got hurt. Actually, I think it was the day that when it happened in that Philadelphia game on that Monday night, where Kevin would almost call 2 plays in the huddle or 2 plays for Mark. One was tell everyone else it's this, and for you it's this. Right. And Mark used that like French, Italian, Spanish, comparison to say like, it's basically the same thing. It's just called something else.
Right.
And so I think that would be obviously is hard, because sometimes the worst one is if like there's a similar word. Like I'm learning French right now, for instance, and
Sure.
travail in Spanish, like one of them is to travel, one of them is to work.
Right.
In English, it's something similar, and I mix up what it is all the time. And sometimes that happens. And so if there's lion in both offenses and you in your head have the wrong one, that's going to cause problems. But if you have an entire offseason to work through it, your coach, and here's the other thing too, a coach can learn new language as well.
Yeah.
And so if you have an entire group of players that's like, we call this lion, it's pretty easy for the coach to make that adjustment as well. One person changing versus 53 or however many are new. And so that is another element of this that I think is interesting, that good coaches can adapt as well. And instead of just enforcing whatever it is on their players, they can say, what do you guys know? Okay, this is the same thing. We'll just call it what you called it. And that's how offenses, by the way, can mold over time. Where say if Kyle got to San Francisco and everyone knew one thing is one thing, maybe he changed it in his offense to be called that, because he could handle it easier than the players changing the entire name of it.
Yeah, and I think, there's definitely a lot of truth to that. And I've been a part of offenses where that's been done. When I was in Atlanta, Sark did that. He basically took his offense, which was a West Coast variation, and put it in Kyle's terminology. And I push back on that. Like this is we're getting in the weeds here a little bit. I want my coordinator thinking in his language and everyone else adjusts. Because I want him thinking about calling the plays and executing that stuff in a language that's appropriate for him. And I coordinators are smart guys and they can work through certain stuff. And I think to your point, certain words, certain phrases, certain concepts will transfer, and that's totally fine. But I like the coordinator to be the guy, like, we're all learning your perspective, we're all learning your language. Right. But I think a good example is that when I went to Atlanta, they called drive Falcon. And I don't know why they did that. It was from Kyle's old terminology, but that's what it was. And so you just had to kind of memorize, like, okay, drive is now Falcon or whatever it is. So is it hard? Yes. Is it going to be a big change? Yes. But West Coast to West Coast, much easier than West Coast to like Air Coryell. And Sam's already done that. He went from Air Coryell to West Coast. So this should be pretty straightforward for him in terms of like, I just got to learn the new concepts, learn the new verbiage. And I think the thing that I go back to is that if this does happen, Sam has shown an ability to get this done. Like he's shown a proclivity for it. And like, if let's say for example, like Sam had a really hard time in training camp with the offense in terms of just getting the plays out, I'd be a little bit worried because I'm like, he doesn't have a history of doing this very well, but he does. Like he's shown an ability to learn it and get it done. Football is important to him. So while yes, it is significant, it is important, I don't think it's the end all be all. And is it ideal? It's definitely not ideal, but
no. Like some people have gone to the extreme of saying like, it's a reason you have to keep EB. And I don't think that's remotely the case.
Well, I
think that a coach has to make a determination of like, it's part of the equation, right? But again, it's, is whatever drop off you'll have and lack of continuity worth it because the upgrade in the relationship in the system. I'm not saying that EB and Sam have a bad relationship, but like the football relationship of like, hey, EB hasn't really insulated Sam. Like that's the kind of things that are being evaluated. And of course there is I would hope the learning curve is something that is thought about. And it's something that I don't know that this administration always thought about in terms of the time it would take to learn certain things for certain players and when they brought them in and put them in certain spots. But the idea that it's so extreme and it's such a big deal to go, especially from West Coast to West Coast, considering I think most of the top candidates will be West Coast, that is so extreme that like it's crazy not to keep EB because of the continuity, I think is taking it way, way too far and is way overestimating the task that it is for Sam Howell to learn a new offense.
And this is something else that I think is important here is like if I think we all are kind of the mindset that there's going to be some big changes this offseason. And if you bring in one of these young dynamic offensive minds, you're bringing them in for their offensive mind. And so as much respect and as much as I appreciate EB, like he coached me in college, like I've got a good relationship. As much as I appreciate him, like I don't think you want differing opinions in the offensive room because I think that can be equally as confusing. Like I remember when I was in San Fran, my tight end coach at the time, who's like one of my best friends from the NFL, he had been in a different offense for a couple of years. So he kept verbalizing Kyle's offense in his old offense and kind of applying those techniques and depths and all that stuff to the offense. And I was like, I don't think this is right. And it was very confusing for everybody in the room because it wasn't quite what Kyle wanted. It wasn't wrong by offensive standards, but it just wasn't a clear one-to-one. And I think I got to point this out too. I think that's one of the reasons why I feel for EB even more in this situation, because he didn't bring any of his own position coaches in to help him articulate his own offense. And that's kind of what I'm saying here is you don't want to repeat that same mistake. You don't want to bring in an offensive coordinator and be like, hey, you guys learn the offense I'm installing. That's not fair to the offensive coordinator. That's not fair to the position coaches or the head coach who is going to be probably offensive minded. That's just not fair. So I think in some ways it'd be cleaner just to kind of say, hey, rip the Band-Aid off. This 100%. Is the new thing. This is the new verbiage. Here are all the position coaches that are familiar with that. And again, that's not necessarily fair to EB. You had a year to kind of work through a very, very challenging situation, but that's ultimately kind of, you got to think about what's best for the organization long-term and kind of separate it from, is it fair for the individual as opposed to, is it what's best for Sam and the organization as a whole? And I think that's something that is obviously very emotionally challenging, but I think ultimately would be the right thing, is just kind of clean sweep, new staff, and install this new offense as you see fit. And again, I understand that that's very callous. And as if I was a coach, I would hate hearing that. But I ultimately think, like, if you're building an organization, that's kind of what Josh Harris has to think about. And I think it shows you the different levels of things people have to consider in building a team and building a franchise.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm Ben Johnson, I don't want Eric Bieniemy here. And that's not personal to EB. I don't want an offensive coordinator who's got strong opinions to be able to subvert potentially what I'm doing. And I would go back to, and not that like EB would be nefarious about it, but like with your tight end coach in San Francisco, like you're just comfortable with something else, or you know
Correct.
something else so well. And so you're like, oh, it's this. And it's like, oh crap, no, it's not. Or it doesn't marry exactly what the coach or coordinator wants. So it's not like the soap opera-y subversion. It's just like, it's hard to do something when you've had success doing it a different way.
He just doesn't know the offense the way that you know the offense, and he knows his thing. Like, he knows his thing really, really well.
Right.
And you do, and you have your thing, and you're trying to put your thing in. So it can just be like convoluted. You know, if someone's teaching in French and you're trying to teach English, like, it's tough. And again, it's not fair. And I have a lot of sympathy for the staff and all that stuff, but I think those are the types of the decisions that need to be made.
I wish my French was better so I could make a joke in French here, but I'm still very bad at French. I go back again to like that 2017-ish through 2020, like when Callahan was here. Like the battles that Callahan and Gruden and O'Connell had were epic. Mm-hmm. And it's because they saw offense differently.
Right.
And, Bill wasn't Jay's guy. Like, Bill Callahan was Bruce Allen's guy.
Right.
It caused problems. And it's not that Bill Callahan's a bad coach. It's not that Jay Gruden was a bad offensive mind. It's not that Kevin O'Connell obviously was a bad offensive mind, or Sean McVay. And there were times that dissent and those differing opinions was good because it pulled them in a direction. And you have a super aggressive, and you need it. It's almost the way that, the pie in the sky view of how politics works, right? It's like you have one party that pushes forward and one that's making sure you don't go too fast. And it's like, that works in theory, but like often you're better off just like going in one direction and trying to push yourself forward. And so that caused a ton of problems, and that's what I'd want to avoid if I was Josh Harris with my new staff. And if I was a head coach interviewing, I'd be like, no, you're not dictating my staff to me. That is a bad precedent, and I don't think Harris is remotely interested in that. Real quick on Sam, like, how do you think he's done in terms of evolving within this system this year and showing the capacity to learn, and kind of where he is at this point in his development as we come out of this bye with 4 games to go?
Yeah, I was talking to John Keim on his podcast about this actually this morning, and the thing that stuck out to me was, he's done some amazing things this year, like really tremendous things. Throws, extending plays, playing outside of structure, showing this like really high level ability. And I think the thing I'm having a hard time at the moment is negotiating that with what I've seen the last 2 weeks, which has been, I don't even know if it's a regression by Sam. It feels like a regression by the offense. And so we're at a point now, after playing Dallas, after playing Miami, where it's like, I don't know where the offense is at. I don't know where Sam is at. And it's making my evaluation of Sam very challenging. So I keep going back to oh man, he did these really amazing things. Like he did this like amazing plays, the throws versus Denver, the touchdown versus New England, like all the completion on third down to Terry where he's got pressure, like amazing plays. You won't see better throws over the course of the year. The throw to tie the game in Seattle, awesome, like just tremendous stuff. But was that the outlier? And this is what's real? I personally think that's what's real, is the good stuff is what's real. But it would be nice going into the offseason to have some positivity around his play and an offense that was playing better. And that's not an indictment of anybody. That's just saying the protection wasn't good last against Miami. The routes weren't good against Miami. Sam made some bad decisions. Like, is EB calling a perfect game? I think he's doing a pretty good job, but it's not perfect all the time. So there's layers to it. And I just want the offense to get to a position where we as analysts, we as fans can finally be like, hey, this is who Sam is, and this is what we're excited about, and this is someone we can build around. But until that happens, it just becomes the evaluation part of it becomes very, very challenging.
Yeah, I think if you had to make the decision today, it'd be incredibly difficult.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it also is going to obviously depend on how they finish the season record-wise, and what they have. Michael Phillips brought up a great point with me last Monday on the radio show, which is if Sam plays really well, he's going to really solidify his place in Washington, not only with the play on the field, but if he wins them a couple of games, he gets them out, or better chance that the best quarterbacks on the board are going to be gone.
Right.
Like not just the top two in Williams and May, but that Jaden Daniels, now the Heisman Trophy winner, could be gone as well. So obviously the farther down the list you go on those quarterbacks, the less likely that guy's going to be better than Sam Howell and worth taking. So that's an interesting thing to watch for sure over these final 4 games of the season. Take a Man podcast from Odyssey Sports. Logan Paulson there, Craig Hoffman here. We are back at MGM this weekend for the Take Command pregame show. 1 o'clock start, so this is a fun show for us, Logan. We get to watch all of the games down there at Tap Sports Bar, MGM National Harbor, in that 1 o'clock window, and then Rams and Commanders kick it off at 4:05. So, next big fact or fiction for us. And this is an interesting theory that you were thinking about this over the weekend, and I'm excited to talk about this. But the fact or fiction statement is essentially having a great quarterback hurts offensive coordinator development. Fact or fiction? And you can be as direct or indirect with your answer as you want, because you're you, and there's no way you're just going to be like, fact, that's it, that's the segment.
No, I think I was thinking about it, and you're like, oh, that can't be a fact. But then you start thinking about it, and it appears to be a fact. Like when you look at, I was thinking about my time in Chicago, and they were just coming off the OC from Denver with Gase, and like that they really struggled, And then you look at everybody that was from the Tom Brady tree, and I think there's other issues there that make it hard for those guys to be successful. But like Weiss, McDaniels, all these guys, they've really, really struggled to kind of translate that offense to other spots. I think Bill O'Brien has been the most successful one.
But he also had like prime Deshaun Watson.
Yes, right. And so I think there's stuff there. And so what I would say is that it appears that starting that elite quarterback makes it really, really challenging to develop what I would call like problem-solving skills, if that makes sense. Like when you're Kyle Shanahan in 2010 to 13, like you don't have a quarterback and you're struggling, and you've got a guy in Robert Griffin who's very talented, but he's got some limitations. So you build an offense that speaks to his strengths, covers up his weaknesses, and you get a very productive season in 2012, right? And I think when you look at him now in San Francisco with Brock Purdy, you see him elevating a guy who obviously people did not have a very high evaluation on, but he's speaking to his strengths, covering up his weaknesses. They have tremendous playmakers around him, and he knows how to maximize those groups. Like he understands that Deebo Samuel is not, Torrey Holt or one of these tremendous route running guys. He's great after the catch. Let's get him the ball in space and let him go to work. Brandon Ayuk is fitting a role for them. George Kittle, again, not this super technical route runner, but he's big and he's fast and he's excellent run blocker. Let's use those skill sets to create separation for him. And so I think when you see these guys who are solving puzzles each week, McDaniels is another, Mike McDaniels is a great example of this too. Like everyone thought Tua was washed, and all of a sudden he gets there, understands the offensive line's not very good, understands what Tua's good at, and builds the offense of this West Coast Kyle Shanahan tree. Maybe Mike Shanahan is the origin of it, genesis of it, and makes it fit Miami. And it looks very different, but the undertones are the same. And same thing with Sean when he went to L.A., right, and LaFleur when he went to Green Bay. They've all kind of shifted and molded and built something in less than ideal situations. And I think that problem solving ability of not having the elite tools, especially in the beginning of your career, makes a more productive, like a more productive football mind. I don't know if that's the right terminology there.
Well, I think problem solving is the ultimate skill, like one of the 2 to 3 ultimate skills a coach can have, right? Like, Obviously we've talked a lot about teaching, right? Can you take the concepts and the techniques that you want your players to execute and actually get those things across in a way that they do that consistently, right? Not just be able to explain them theoretically, but explain them in a way that they make so much sense that the players do them correctly on a regular basis. So that is to me, the number one skill, right? Can you teach execution, basically? Yeah. But what are you actually executing? And it's not the ability to draw stuff up on paper that works with X's and O's. It's the ability to work with your X's and O's. How do you maximize certain things, minimize other things? And it's like the difference. Shout out to my guy, Chris Gorez, who's my other podcast co-host on the Train with the Best podcast. But he talks about like how intelligence and knowledge are 2 very different things. Or maybe it's intelligence and wisdom. If he was here, he could get it right because he's smarter than me. He's Ivy League. But like one is about knowing stuff, right? You have the right answers somewhere in your head, but the other one is about asking the right questions in the first place. And that is the key. Can you actually ask the right questions as opposed to just regurgitate information? And I think that ability is like the 100% biggest thing that is the difference in some of these coaches, where it's like when you have Tom Brady, you just need to have some answers, right? You just need to have some information, and Tom Brady will do the problem solving for you.
Correct. Yes.
Whereas like if you have young Kirk Cousins, young Robert Griffin, young Jared Goff, older Kirk Cousins, for Kevin in Minnesota, like he took what Kirk was, which is really good at certain stuff and detrimentally bad in other areas, and was like, I know how to get the best out of this guy. And he had the best season of his career and was on pace to have another great statistical year with some wins this year until obviously he tears the Achilles. Even taking very good talent and elevating it to great, we talk often because it was right before you got there about Kyle and Matt Ryan, right? Yeah. Can you take Matt Ryan, who was excellent, and turn him into the MVP that leads you to a Super Bowl that you should have won? Then that's the question. And I think that when you have Mahomes, who solves so many problems for you, and you go to Sam Howell, if you're Eric Bieniemy, you haven't had to, whether it's there or not, you haven't had to flex, work out, exercise that muscle in a while, because Mahomes does all the problem solving for you, that it can take a while to adjust from calling plays for Patrick Mahomes to Sam Howell, because you don't even know what questions you're supposed to be answering.
Yeah, and I think like when you look at the Kansas City offense, especially like this offseason, I thought there were there's times where we're talking about some of the plays that we've seen. It's like, oh, like this post is wide open. I forget who it was. It was against the Giants. No, it was against the Cowboys. And you're like, oh my gosh, like this CO concept, like that angle, that deep kind of crossing post is wide open for a touchdown. And it's not just problem solving physically. It's problem solving understanding the offense. Like Patrick Mahomes has been in that offense for a long time. And if he's in this offense, I'm pretty confident, like 90% confident that's a touchdown for the Commanders if Patrick Mahomes is here, right? And so
if you get Patrick Mahomes, how much would Patrick Mahomes want the Commanders receivers, by the way?
Yeah, he'd be pretty stoked about it right now.
Talk about that another time, but good God, their receivers are... Anyway, you were saying.
But I think that's part of it. And then you talk about, where like just executing the offense and working that progression, understanding where the ball's got to go. You mentioned Tom Brady, and Tom Brady was able to consistently elevate bad receivers. And I think you look at Bill Belichick now and like the way he's built that team, he's like still building it like Tom Brady's there. He's basically saying like Tom Brady will bail us out of this bad receiver group. It's like, well, he's not here anymore. He's not going to work through the progression. He's not going to find the best matchups. He's not going to be able to sit back there in the shotgun, elevate protection looks, and distribute the football accurately to a receiver who doesn't create great separation. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And I think we've seen elements of that from EB this year. But I think like he's learning that skill where like Kyle, Sean, like that whole tree, that offense, it's funny because that offense, like the foundational seed of that offense is built around problem solving because they had to in its genesis
Right.
here in Washington.
Right. No, that's such a great point. I mean, all those guys were involved in building that 2012 offense that you were a part of that was like, how do we take this incredibly limited but super talented guy in Robert Griffin and use his legs, which were also like his running was a unique skill set. He wasn't shifty. Like he was just fast. Like Robert is a sprinter. Sprinters don't change directions. Football players need to change directions. And so it's like, how do we get him in space where he can run in a straight line? And how do we use his very strong arm with limited, because he just didn't do it at Baylor. It's not like Robert's a dummy. To be very clear, like he hadn't had to read defenses in the NFL.
Right.
And they also the pistol stuff they did to eliminate some of the issues that we've talked about when you run from the shotgun. Like there were so many smart ways that they were like, well, this is a problem. How do we solve it? Okay, now that we got that part, what about this plug that we need to go in over here? And when you look at anyone who's worked at Mahomes and then left, like Nagy, it didn't go very well when he went to Chicago, and now he's back in Kansas City. EB has had a severe adjustment period here versus like Doug Peterson, who left after working with Alex Smith for Philadelphia and had to flex that problem-solving muscle in a major way when Carson Wentz got hurt, and he won a Super Bowl with Nick Foles. And now, obviously, he's working with a great quarterback in Jacksonville, but he's having to solve some problems as they're having all kinds of issues down there. But generally speaking, like Doug Peterson, good job. He's had to flex that muscle in a different way than the guys who worked with under Andy Reid with Mahomes. Same with Manning. There's a long list of, because Manning also was like part offensive coordinator. So he really didn't have to flex that muscle as much. It was much more collaboration, which I do think is the final point I want to make real quick. There is a skill set to working with a great player. And it's just, I think it's a different skill set. Like, it's not like Josh McDaniels is a terrible football mind. He's the right muse for Tom Brady. Yeah. Right? They think about the game in similar ways. And going back to our discussion in the first segment, like they think about the game in similar ways. They speak the same language. Yeah. They find ways to work together, but it's a very different skill set than what is required when you don't have Tom Brady. And I think that's something to think about to spin this back to the Commanders on top of obviously what we're talking about with EB. But I want the next head coach here to be someone that has had to do that some. It's why I like Ben Johnson so much. And obviously, look, the Lions yesterday, not very great offensively. It'd help if they didn't fumble the football and go 1 for 5, or two picks, a fumble, and they went 1 for 5 on 4th down again. So that's going to hurt your offensive output.
Yep.
But he has turned Jared Goff into a guy that was near the top of the MVP list for parts of the last 2 seasons. Like, that's incredible. I want that guy working with Sam Howell versus someone who has worked with one of these elite quarterbacks and then is going to have to plug some holes because while Sam has a lot of upside talent, he's clearly not Brady, Mahomes, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think to your point too, like think about Detroit and like Amon-Ra. No, that's not him.
Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yeah.
I get him in as Equanimous as his brother. Anyway,
yeah.
So Amon-Ra, like not the most physically gifted receiver of all time, but how do we maximize his skill set? You know, how do we maximize Reynolds, the receiver? Like they've just found ways to fit those guys in their spots and maximize the offense and maximize the individuals. You know, they've got one of the best O-lines in football. They lean on people, they run well, but they also do a great job of schematically elevating those guys. So I think it's problem solving. It's this hunger, like you alluded to kind of say, this is what he does well. Like, how do we get this better from him? And I go back to that piece that we listened to, the Game Changers. I forget who did it.
The play callers with Jordan Rodriguez. Yeah.
And how when he was with Jared Goff in Detroit, he basically said, like, we want to run all these play action concepts, but Goff doesn't see it very well. So how do we get to these concepts from a drop back while still helping the offensive line out? I thought that's brilliant. And you've seen shades of that from EB here. So it's not like EB doesn't do innovative, exciting football things. It's just that problem solving muscle and speaking to skill sets and maximizing the players you have is something that you have to practice. And I think when these guys work with elite quarterbacks, the problem solving element is just different. And it's not a feature of the offense. Like, you know, I think Bill O'Brien's a brilliant guy, but when I was with him in Houston, like, it's like, we're running the offense. We're running my offense. And Deshaun Watson was good enough at that time. Like, he was really good at that time.
Yeah,
just
that was the peak of his powers.
Like, I'll break a tackle, I'll skate out of this, and I'll throw a bomb to Kenny Stills for a touchdown. You're like, okay. Like, that wasn't how it looked on paper, but like, he elevated that and made it happen. So I think there is something to what I think what we're talking about. We probably need to do like a more longitudinal look at it, but it feels like when you got bad players, you got to kind of be the MacGyver of football a little bit.
Yeah, and it's not even bad players if you just have
Or
above average players that aren't the elite.
Correct. Yes.
Which is most of the NFL. So that's good. By the way, also in Detroit, speaking about like the receivers and how they've elevated them, shout out to your old teammate Antoine Randall. Their receivers coach is doing a great job up there. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. Wrapping up here with Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. All right, a few more quick fact or fictions. Logan, we just talked about elevating different pieces of an offense as a coach, and I think by the way, there's probably a whole other segment we could do on the defensive side, like your old head coach Dan Quinn, what he's done in Dallas with Micah Parsons. Like, oh, we got this guy who's not good enough to play off-ball linebacker. Oh, he seems to be awesome rushing. What if we put him there full time? Right. Oh, we have the best defense in football. That's cool. So like there's that element. But I think something that's interesting that has certainly been a topic of conversation here in Washington is the offensive line play. And people, fans are like, this is the worst offensive line I've ever seen. And we're sitting here trying to tell people it's actually about league average. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But could it be closer to both than we'd want to admit? Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated, of course, the Monday morning quarterback, tweeted something out yesterday that was basically like, I think we're seeing it today, and with the offensive line play on Sunday, and it's something I've thought for a while. I think offensive line play is down around the entire NFL, and Breer's reasoning is rooted in the CBA, where you don't have a chance to practice with contact in the way that you used to. I saw one of Doc Flynn, who's one of the kind of Twitter doctors. She's worked in NFL circles before. Respond to Breer saying, like, if you want more evidence, about a third of the NFL starting quarterbacks are out right now due to injury, which tells you they're not being protected very well. So when you watch offensive line play around the league, like, do you think it's down compared to 10 years ago when you were playing under the old CBA?
I mean, yeah, probably, but I also think it's more complicated than that. Like, I'm a big believer. Yeah, new CBA, like, it's tough, man. It's tough to just find reps because it's different than receivers or defensive linemen where you're kind of working patterns and you're in this very aggressive attacking posture. It's like, I need to work combinations. I need to get a feel for how this guy is going to take his steps and what I can get away with from a double team standpoint. In pass protection, how quickly is he going to be able to get back out to me? All those things are things that are working as kind of a living, breathing organism, as opposed to receivers who I can get cones out. You're a coach. You can put cones out and we can do reactive drills and we can throw the ball and we can talk about coverages and we can get a couple guys from the local high school out there to stand in spots and I can find the zones. And it's just, there's a martial art element to offensive line play. And I think just don't look any farther than good martial artists. They practice a lot. They hit each other a lot. They wrestle a lot. They do their judo. They do their jujitsu. Like, it's a constant process. And here, by eliminating the CBA, it's become way more challenging to develop that skill set. And this is the second part of my answer that I think is so important. Is now, like back when I first started playing, people didn't rush the passer the way they rush the passer now. Like, it's a skill set that has been developed and cultivated. Like, you watch these pass rushing coaches, you watch what the Bosa's do, the Myles Garrett's do, and then you watch what the backups do, and they are so dialed in. Like, back when I was playing, like, you'd be lucky if you saw a spin move. Like, everyone was freaking out about Dwight Freeney's spin move,
right?
And that was an amazing move, right? And he was an amazing pass rusher.
Got him to the Hall of Fame
type guy, right? He's a fantastic football player, but the reason people were talking about it was because it was a little bit of an outlier. Now, everybody's got this wide array of moves and counter moves, and you're throwing the ball more than you've ever thrown it before. So you're exposing these guys to the most, everyone says DB is the most challenging position to play. And I think that's probably true in football outside of quarterback. But offensive line on 3rd and 10, when it's an obvious passing situation, it's hard for me to believe that there's any harder situation than that in football. There's really just, it's so challenging. And then all the good athletes end up playing defensive line. So you're getting kind of just this clash of cultures and like these big, burly, slower twitch guys that are good athletes in their own right, but much more eccentrically driven in terms of force absorption, as opposed to these defensive ends that are like could play receiver for some teams. So I think that's another dichotomy that needs to be explored too, is the evolution of pass rushers is so much greater. The evolution of defensive football is so much greater. Like, we would block a 4-down front and they would just line up in their positions and we would block them. And now you watch, Dallas is a great example, and they're stunting like every single play. And that is extremely challenging, especially with the limited reps and opportunities. So I think, yes, the offseason is a huge factor, no doubt about it. That limited kind of exposure is very, very challenging. But I also think that defensive play, especially in the front, has gotten way more complicated and way more, and the athletes have gotten way better. And I think that's something people want to kind of ignore because of the CBA, because there's like this obvious correlation. And I also think college football too. I know I'm kind of rambling, but college football, everyone's running the spread. No one runs pro style offenses. You don't have to develop that skill set. So you're getting a bunch of guys that are physically very talented, but are not sharpened in the way that guys used to be sharpened coming out of college.
Yeah, I would be super curious to go like by conference. And it feels like the Big Ten has a great reputation for linemen. And I feel like for a long time, we're more pro style offenses in the Big Ten. And so, for that, for sure. Our producer William just put up a great point. Like, Iowa for years has been the place for offensive line play, which is also hilarious now because Iowa's offense is like literally a joke. It's a meme of how bad it is.
Well, like Wisconsin too, Michigan, like Ohio State. Like, think about Ohio State. They had 2 guys go in the first round last year, and the center got drafted. I mean, like he didn't go in the first. They had 2 first-round talents. One went in the 4th. The center went in the 5th. Like, there's a reason you go to those places for offensive line play.
Right. And so there's some great defensive linemen out of that conference as well. So you get some of the iron sharpening iron as well. That happens. But, I think overall you make a bunch of great points. The speed element of training, I think, is really important for something this technical. And it's one thing to like practice it slow in a walkthrough with other offensive linemen acting as your defensive linemen, because you have time to do that all day with the current CBA.
100%. And that's important. That's important.
Yeah,
no doubt.
That stuff is super important. But do you then ever get the full speed reps? And it's just really hard to get them. And often, like, if an OC, for instance, here, like obviously Eric does a lot of stuff with the practices in terms of the script. That was a responsibility that was given to him. Something that I've kind of wondered about the drop off in the Commanders' defense this year is like how much of the lack of practice of certain things, whether it's running the football or, hey, we need this to happen offensively because we're trying to install this new offense. Does the defense not go full bore or not stunt or not this? And then the offensive line doesn't get the practice at it. And then all of a sudden they get in the game and it's like, all right, let's run that thing that we installed, and the front does something totally different and they're not prepared for it. So I think that's a huge element. I think the college football point is great. And then, that kind of turn up of defensive line skill is fascinating. Is there a counter offensively, like other than trying to get better athletes to play the O-line? Because I guess there's only so many ways you can block and so many techniques. It's not like there's going to be an anti-spin move block that gets developed by some freakish offensive tackle that everybody follows in 10 years.
Well, that's where I think scheme is so important. And I think when you look around the league right now, like San Fran, Miami, Houston, not really talented offensive lines. And I think in Miami's case, kind of a bad group, but you don't know about it because I think understanding what's challenging, like I think even Dan Quinn, when he in Dallas, like, we just talked about what are the most challenging things to do in football, like cover and pass block. So let's limit those coverage opportunities in Dallas with an amazing pass rush, and let's limit those pure drop back pass protections reps by running a lot of play action, a lot of RPO, a lot of zone read, and let's make it so we're only doing that 5 to 10 times in a game. Because you can win 5 to 10 times, especially if the defensive line doesn't know. Like, I do my reports for some guys every week, and when we come to Miami every single week, it's like I don't have a good tell for you about anything they're going to do. And that makes it extremely challenging to rush the passer. Tua understands that too. He gets the ball out faster than anybody in the league. That's, again, they've built everything in there to insulate that group. They've got fast receivers. They've got explosive playmakers. They can run these little screens and bubbles. Ball can get out quick because that's challenging. And you would never know that that's bad offensive line play. You would never know unless you went and like poured through the metrics like I do every single week. Because it's not a storyline in the NFL. Same thing with San Fran. Their offensive line outside of Trent Williams is playing worse than it's played in like the last 5 or 6 years. But you don't know about it because their offense is crazy productive, because Kyle does a good job of knowing the hardest thing, the rate limiter for the offense is the offensive line. And so if you look at Philly, they run a ton of drop back. They've got the best offensive line in football. They can get away with that. But it's hard to find 5 studs. Like, think about it. Like Lane Johnson, when Nick Bosa plays Lane Johnson, like, it doesn't matter. Lane Johnson's erased, or Nick Bosa's erased from the game because he's that good athletically. But it's hard to find 5 guys like that. And I think that's one of the beauties of what McDaniels did in Miami, to give him some credit, is he said, it's hard to find 5 big athletic studs to play offensive line. But you know what we can do? We can find a couple really fast wide receivers and speak to our quarterback getting the ball out of his hand quickly, and then no one talks about our offensive line anymore. And I think that's where I think offensive minds just in general in the NFL need to bring more awareness, is like, that's the hardest thing in this offense. Running back, nah, you can find running backs, receivers, hard to find 5 big studs. And I think Philly's about as close as you're going to get in the NFL right now. Detroit maybe also. I think that's something else we got to call attention to. Detroit's offensive line at the moment is very, very good because they've invested, they've hit on picks, they've developed guys. But to your point, it's the type of athlete on the offensive line that leads to offensive line production. You know, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
you get a Penei Sewell out there, or you get a Trent Williams, and it totally changes. Like, that's the thing too. If you can get one stud, it changes everything else you do. Because if you can rely on one person to win one-on-one, how you devote the other 4 plus your backs and tight ends, the numbers change dramatically.
Correct.
All right. That is our show for today. Now, Logan just talked about doing reports, and he sounds very smart because he is very smart. But could he be an NFL coach? Just like tomorrow, step into it. That's going to be Take 5 tomorrow. We'll see you then for that. And then we should have a guest on Thursday. Pretty pumped for this. We haven't 100% locked it in, but we're hoping to be talking NFL draft on Thursday, as well as previewing the Rams. So we'll see you then. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of it here on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.